Putting Amazing Back into Grace, Embracing the Heart of the Gospel by Michael Horton. Chapter 3, Rebels Without a Cause. Nearly all of us are involved in the lemonade business sometime during childhood. I can recall my thriving enterprise at the edge of the sidewalk. I spent more time mixing the lemonade than actually selling it. You see, I was not content to simply add the packet and stir. No, no, I was a lemonade connoisseur. Anybody could empty a bit of powder into a jar of water. But my lemonade had to have my own trademark. It had to be my product. It's a truth were to be known, and I'm man enough today to admit it, that was clearly the worst drink I have ever tasted. Yet, even though the lemonade was a culinary assault, I humored myself that it was much improved due to my creativity, and others humored me, my parents especially. I haven't made lemonade in years, but still I find myself giving into the irresistible temptation to assume that if something's going to be done right, I would have to do it myself. I must contribute something if it is going to be acceptable. I still humor myself and am humored by others. Advertisers reinforce this humoring process by telling us, quote, you deserve a break today, end quote, and quote, you can have it your way, end quote. They prompt us to demand the very finest hair care because I'm worth it. We begin thinking from birth that at the center of the universe, but we know better. We know deep down that the lemonade is sour, just as the same we move on pretending that we can conquer every obstacle ourselves if given half a chance. This tendency is part of what we inherited from Adam in the fall. The better we understand the tragedy that event and its readers, the better we will appreciate God's amazing grace. Fallen stars. You know the story. God created humans in his own image and took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work and take care of it. Then he gave Adam his instructions. You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it you will surely die. Genesis 2:15 through 17. The process in this fatal decision is instructive. It began with Satan's direct rebellion against God's word. He declared, you will not surely die, Genesis 3:4. There is no baiting around the bush here. Satan always downplays the gravity of and its consequences. What he really said is, look, Eve, you're not looking at this thing with an open mind. God is just intimidating you with all this talk of punishment. After all, God's bark is worse than his bite. This first strike must have left a mark in Eve's mind because she began to dialogue with the serpent. The same argument still works on God it still works on us. God is viewed as a sort of benign George Burns character who looks the other way and lets bygones be bygones. He is not considered quite as holy as the scriptures make him out to be, not nor as just. In fact, he exists for our happiness, not we for his. Mistake number one. The second stage in Satan's plan was to use the same lines on Eve that he has so effectively used on himself. In his own rebellion, Eve took the bait and humans have taken it ever since. You will be like God, Genesis 3:5. Adam and Eve decided that they would have it their way. After all, they were worth it. Invictus, a 19th century poem by William Ernst Henley, expresses well this sentiment. I thank, therefore, whatever gods that be, for my conquerable soul. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. After all, Satan argued God was restricting human freedom because he didn't want any competition. You are obedient, he told Eve, only because you have never discovered yourself. A quest for he told Eve no a quest for the enlightenment was that she needed. Eve and Adam Adam deserve a break today. Sure, it costs a little more, but you're worth it. Have it your way. God was trying to take away Adam and Eve's self esteem and rain on their parade, the serpent reasoned. Satan was arguing that Adam and Eve could transcend their self identity as creatures and become gods themselves, autonomous individualists who no longer needed the restraints of the creator creature relationship. Maybe I do have an inconquerable soul, Eve began to reason. Satan further undermined God's authority by adding to the requirement God had given Adam. Did God really say, "You must not eat from any tree in the garden"? He cunningly inquired. Genesis 3:1. Of course, God did not say that he couldn't eat from any tree in the garden. But if Satan can get us to feel oppressed and closed in rather than cared for and liberated by God, if, in other words, he can turn God into a cosmic legalist, he can more easily convince us of the need for mutiny. In their empirical study of the psychology of religion, Bernard Spilka, Ralph Hood, and Richard Gorush point out the numerous studies have concluded that while Jews show the least abstinence from alcohol, they possess extremely low rates of psychological thinking. On the other hand, Methodists express negative attitudes toward drinking, yet a study of college samples shows that the more Methodist students drink to get intoxicated than any other group. The same irony shows up in Mormon samplings and other simplistic groups. On the other hand, Judaism considers alcohol a gift of God that must not be abused, and Orthodox and conservative Jews become intoxicated less than their Reform or secular co religionists. Conclusion: alcoholism seems to be troublesome among groups that generally take the most negative stance toward unlimited drinking. This is just one example of how legalism can undermine law. Many of the most hardened secularists in society today were raised in repressive, authoritarian religious requirements. Legalism, adding to God's word, continues to drive people away from God. This is one reason why adding to his commandment is condemned equally without subtracting from them. In Satan's strategy, legalism was a useful tool as lawlessness, and nobody Eve's response. And notice Eve's response. She rightly connected that God had said they could eat freely from the trees in the garden, but she continued, God had also said, "You must not eat from the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die." Genesis 3:3. So on one hand, she rejected Satan's addition to God's commandment, but she turned around and added her own, that of not touching the tree. God had given them paradise. "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden," he told them, with the exception of one single tree. Obviously, if Adam and Eve were to eat from that tree, it would be out of rebellion, not out of necessity. This is still our way. Although God has given us so much to take pleasure in, we are not content until we have indulged in that which is forbidden. In his confession, St. Augustine tells a story of how he and his friends would plunder the neighbor's pear tree. It was not out of necessity any more than Adam's actions were as he had of a pleasant pear tree in his own backyard. Rather, he confessed the pleasure was in the sin, not in the pear. The neighbor's pears tasted better precisely because they were stolen. When the woman saw that the fruit of the pear tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was there with her, and he ate it. Genesis 3:6. Eve was attracted visually by the packaging and was also attracted by the promises the tree was advertised to guarantee. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves, and together they made coverings for themselves. Genesis 3:7. This too has been part and parcel of the human condition since the fall. We try to cover up our shame. Sometimes we spend hundreds of dollars on seminars, or therapists will tell us how they deny our shame. And yet we know deep down that we feel ashamed because we have behaved shamefully. We feel guilty because we are guilty. When Adam and Eve took the big risk and found themselves, they realized they were lost. Religion is, for the most part, our way of covering ourselves, a means of sewing respectability, morality, and charity into a patchwork garment that can hide our nakedness. A declaration of independence. In a Time magazine essay titled What Really Matters, Robert Rosenblatt sought to define the idea of characterizing our age. The essay suggests that the 20th century spirit is distinguished by its determination to break away from traditional norms and eventually from any constraints at all, and that the basis of the determination is the assumption that what was not free to ought to be free, that limits were intrinsically evil. This provocative critique of modern culture draws its conclusion about our age of self-confident autonomy by noting when people are unfettered they are freed but not yet free. The essayists understood more about freedom of choice than Adam and Eve did that day when they gave to Satan's grandiose opinion or notion of self confidence, autonomy. Yet it is precisely that notion that has kept God and humans apart since the fall of Eden. Adam and Eve resented God. How dare God withhold us from the knowledge of good and evil? It is curious that the vogue pursuit today is knowledge, the experience of good and evil. In fact, we have reached the point where the lines separating the two regions appear altogether. We moderns talk about sexual liberation, and yet, even without AIDS and a host of other sexually transmitted diseases, we know the morning after when people are unfettered, they are freed but not yet free. From what does such a sexual liberation free us? Free from homes where family members care about each other, turning them instead into places where selfish individuals constantly look after their own independence? Or how about the freedom to end the lives of unborn infants? How free is the woman who realizes she has taken the child's life? How free is a jet set yuppie who finds that he can't quit cocaine when ever he wants to? A corporate executive may have made his millions by breaking all the rules, but is he free? Your eyes will be open, Satan promised, Genesis 3:5. But then he has always been a liar. I have found the following lines written on a painting in one of my favorite cafes. I have taken the pill. I have hoisted my skirts to my thighs, dropped them to my ankles, rebelled at the university, skied at Aspen, lived with two men, married one, earned my keep, kept my identity, and frankly, I'm lost. Ours is indeed a generation that has seen it all, and many teens of today are experienced beyond their elders in sex, drugs, and life in general. Many men boast about macho infidelity, while many women, too, make a break with their homes. Individuals, we are no longer fathers and mothers, children and brothers and sisters, but solitary, isolated individuals who happen to live under the same roof and share similar experiences. Yet it's essential to put all of this in perspective. We should not be shocked by the disintegration of relationships. It is not, as many have argued, that the result of a nation's retreat from a supposedly golden era when everybody thought and lived from a supposedly golden era where everybody thought and lived like an episode of Leave It to Beaver. It is the result of the fall. Humans have always been sinful, have always been shake, prone just shaking their fists in God's face, and that includes you and me. The Genesis account that teaches us that since the fall there has never been an era somewhere in the past known as the good old days. When we see the fall in contrast to the glory of creation, we have some measuring stick for the tragedy of sin. Suppose a cheap glass vase falls from the top shelf in the kitchen and is broken beyond repair. Into the bin it goes, but suppose a thief breaks into a museum's central vault and makes off with its most prized artifact, a perfectly preserved, one of a kind vase from the ancient Greeks. The police would be called, and the culprit would be hunted down and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Similarly, we have made off with God's image. We have distorted and disfigured God's creation. We have we would have an excuse perhaps if we could say that there was a lack or a defect in our nature. Yet the problem is not our humanness, but what we have done with our humanness. We have directed all of our gifts, our religious, moral, creative, and intellectual abilities toward a declaration of independence from God. We have used the very assets with which He endowed us as weapons against him. Clothed in of his very image, we have shaken our fists at God and said with Adam and Eve, "How dare you?" This is why the threat attached to eating from the forbidden fruit was so severe. When you eat of it, you will surely die. Genesis 2:17. Our fall was complete. Every area of human life was affected, and nothing created by God was left untouched. Consequently, the stain of sin corrupts us physically, emotionally, and psychologically, mentally, morally, and spiritually. That doesn't mean, of course, that we are all brute savages who can always carry out every possible evil. It does mean that each one of us is capable of doing so. Further, it means that there is no hope for human beings to recover themselves or to make amends. God demands a perfection of the qualities with which He endowed us, and we are corrupted in every chamber. No part of us can rescue or heal the rest of us. When our relationship with God has severed and in sense diplomatic relations were discontinued, all of life went wrong. It was not just our religious or devotional lives that were affected. The sinful condition corrupts our relationships, our health, our happiness, our careers, all of our activities, along with social, political, and economic effects we see all around us. Those who might want to wish it away with positive thinking simply cannot explain the thick, dark strokes on the canvas. The Bible is a good deal more realistic about the human condition than its popular American culture. The horror of human evil that disappeared on September 11, 2001 in New York and the U.S. Capitol comes as no surprise to the reader of Scripture. Just because humanity declared independence does not mean that it became independent. We can no more live independently of God than a fish can live independently of water. For in Him we live and move and have our being. Acts 17:28. Adam and Eve sought a self identity that did not require God as a reference point. In the bargain, they lost their identity, experiencing political illness. Now they became fatigued and frustrated with their work instead of being as fulfilled as they had been before. They grew discontented with each other. The second male, Adam's son Cain, murdered his own brother. Guilt stained innocence. Adam and Eve were ashamed of themselves and disillusioned. Their guilt was more than fig leaves could hide. We need to stop running from God and from the guilt that we must all own. We cannot find God for the same reason that a thief can't find a police officer. If we find him, or if he catches up to us, he will expose us for who we really are. This is why Paul repeated the psalmist on lamenting. There is no one who understands, no one who seeks God. Romans 3:11. What fig leaves are we wearing? God is not impressed with our empty offerings of human achievement. We may humor our children when they can concoct their lemonade, but with God is serious. There is nothing we can offer him, nothing we can contribute. So it would seem that we are in quite a predicament. All have robbed God, and there are no good robbers. The thief and the theologian must both come to God on the same terms. Our hope is in God's mercy, for the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost. Matthew 18:11. Christ said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. For I have come not to call the righteous, but sinners." Matthew 9:12-13. To put it simply, the condition and qualifying for God's grace is to recognize that you can't quite qualify. After Christ, our efforts before God, they ask, "Who then can be saved?" And he answered, "With man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible." Matthew 19:26. Someone to blame. We're always looking for a scapegoat, much as Adam did. When God confronted Adam after his disobedience, the culprit said, "It's her fault. The one you gave me made me eat the fruit." And Eve answered, "The devil made me do it." For both the fault and to be located outside their own will and activity. This should not be too unfamiliar to those of us surrounded by a pampered society that is committed to shifting blame to parents, employers, employees, spouses, children, minorities, majorities, big business, big government, and so on. While sin is institutional as well as individual, the location of our blame is on our sinful hearts. If we reconsider Rabbi Kushner's popular alternative to the Hebrew Christian understanding of an all-good and all-powerful God, we can see the same sort of buck passing that began in Eden. If bad things happen to good people, he suggests, God must not be powerful as we once thought. But Kushner's argument begins with the most debatable presupposition. When did bad things begin to happen to good people? On the contrary, bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to bad people. But there is only one who is good. Matthew 19:17. According to Scripture, the fall makes us not only victims, but also victimizers. With Adam and Eve, we are all in this thing together, and none of the fall's effects, sin, pain, suffering, tragedy, can be blamed on God. This world as we know it is not normal. It is not as God created it, but as humans have shaped it after their own character. God took a look at the world he had created and said, "It is very good." If God were not in control of every event and individual, the full force of our sinful hearts would cast off all restraint. Whilst reserving saving grace for believers, God nevertheless gives the common grace to all men and women, and this is responsible for the good we see in people like ourselves. To insist that we are the cause of whatever is wrong in this world does not mean, for instance, that we each take personal responsibility for every hostage situation in the Middle East. It does mean, however, that we must realize we are part of the problem and that each day we contribute our sins against God and neighbor. Our pride, arrogance, and rebellion against God are only underscored by blaming God for, say, a bad environment. While we continue to release our toxic, unnatural refuse into the air, that is our way. We pollute life and blame God for the results. The fall, in a sense, reverses the act of creation by turning order into chaos, and yet even the confusion and chaos is controlled and held in shock by the Creator. Although we are entirely responsible for our guilt, the fall did not surprise God. It was part of the plan all along. He had organized a plan of redemption long before that fateful moment in the Eden. For the creation was subjected to frustration not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Romans 8:20 to 22. Even when bad things happen to bad people, God turns it around for good. A lethal injection. We have all heard tragic stories of people who are received blood transfusions donated by those who are unwitting carriers of a deadly disease. When Adam and Eve turned on God, guilt, both the fact and the feeling, rushed into their spiritual veins. However, marred and disfigured the image of God in Adam and Eve remained. Nothing about them changed chemically or biologically. They were not mysteriously changed into a different form of life, but they were guilty for the first time. Like the victims of a contaminated blood transfusion, we all have inherited Adam's guilt and corruption. This is what theologians call original sin. Adam concluded us all in his decision, and that decision was a fatal for the entire race. This concept is often hard to swallow, particularly in America, where we are saturated with the democratic ideal of being where we are, being able to decide for ourselves what party we will join, but we did not decide whether we would belong to the Adamic party. We were born into it. The same is true, though, in a lot of areas. For instance, when Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence, he spoke for you and me. We were not actually there. We didn't get to help him decide what to write, and yet this document represents us just the same as if we had been there. We were born American citizens, not British, because of individuals who lived and events that took place long before we came along. In the same way, Adam was our representative before God, and he spoke for us. As Adam's children and heirs, we think his thoughts and imitate his actions, in by this instinct without having met him. This means that while we were incapable of incredible artistic, intellectual, and cultural accomplishments due to creation, we are also capable of unbelievable cruelty and harm due to the fall. The psalmist confessed, "Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me." Psalm 51:5. And Isaiah recognized that even he was a rebel from birth. Isaiah 48:8. It doesn't matter whether you are fifth generation Christian or fifth generation atheist, whether you are a minister or a murderer, whether you sing in the choir or in a topless bar. We are all equally guilty in God's courtroom. When a corporation dumps toxic chemicals into the end of a stream, it's not just the one area that is affected. Soon the pollution washes all the way down the stream, and the entire river is polluted. Adam's rebellion had just this effect. Our whole race became corrupted, so much so that viewing his collectively, God concluded together, they have become useless. Romans 3:12. Those are strong words, but biblical ones. Nevertheless, one person is no better than another. We're all in this together. Another illustration drawn men from biblical testament is that of written will leaving to an estate to heirs. We are born heirs of Adam. Everything he has belongs to us. His nature, his condition, his guilt, and his debts. We learn that the patriarch of the human family has left us with a massive estate and debt. His enemies, including God, are ours, and the rivalries are wounds reopened by us every day, just as any earthly heir cannot separate his or her personality, character, identity, and resources from the inheritance of ancestors, so none of us comes into the world a blank slate. When we are born, then we are born at odds with a God for whose pleasure we were created. There was no innocent little babies, and the Bible knows of no age of accountability. When when can when hold on. One can choose to believe, as I do, that all who die in infancy are saved, but one must credit that to God's mercy, not to his justice. God could condemn every infant for eternity. There is already enough evidence to make a conviction. Sin entered the world through one man, and said Paul, and the result of one trespass was condemnation for all men. Romans 5:12 through 18. I can quit whenever I want to. All of this means that we are sinners not only by the choice, but also by birth. We are not born in a neutral zone, but as enemies of God. By nature, children of wrath, we do not merely do evil, we are evil. The heart is deceitful above all things, and beyond cure, who can understand it? Jeremiah 17:9. We not only fall, we are fallen. We not only get lost, we are lost. We sin because it is our nature to sin. We are most comfortable when we are committing sin in some form or another. In Romans 6:16, the apostle Paul wrote, "Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone to obey him as slaves, you are slaves to the one whom you obey? Whether you are slaves to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness." He added that we are by nature slaves to sin, and that when you were slaves to sin, you were free from the control of righteousness. In other words, righteousness made no demands on which we by nature could fulfill. Our Lord said that everyone who sins is a slave to sin, John 8:34, and infuriated the religious leaders by informing them that no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, John 6:44. So desperate is the human predicament because of the fall. So we can't quit whenever we want to. We may be able to stop a certain habit, but we cannot stop sinning. We may be able to curb certain acts of sin, but we cannot cease from being sinful. That is true even of Christians who will experience freedom from sin only in paradise. When I say we can't stop sinning or cease from being sinful, I don't mean can't in the sense that an outside force is overpowering us, controlling our actions against our will. Rather, the very sinful disposition of our will determines the unyielding reign of sin in our lives before regeneration. Since the fall, sin is as much human nature as barking is a dog's nature. When Adam sinned, the entire human race died spiritually. Hence, every human birth is spiritually speaking a stillbirth. Hence, every human birth is spiritually speaking a stillbirth. There are movements toward God. We are, from the very beginning, in bondage to sin, slaves to our selfish wills. When you eat of it, you will surely die. That was God's warning. Of course, Adam did not die physically on that very day, but he did experience spiritual death then and there. Paul tells Christians they were dead in trespasses and sins before God regenerated them. Ephesians 2:1. Hence, the human will is in bondage to sin. This does not mean that we can sin against our will, i.e., by force. Rather, our will is in bondage to sin, and when we do sin, our sin is in perfect harmony with the will which produced it. Martin Luther put it this way: a man who does not have the Spirit of God does not, to be sure, do evil unwillingly by compulsion, as if grabbed by the neck and forced to do it, as a thief or a highwayman is dragged to punishment against his will. He does evil spontaneously and with a ready will, but he is unable to by his own powers to stop, check, or change his readiness or willingness to do evil. Rather, he goes on willingly and craves evil. And even if he should be compelled by force to do something that is outwardly different, yet the will within remains averse to it and rears up in indignation against the power that controls and constrains it. Dead to God and alive to self, humans are incapable of taking a single step toward God, not because of some internal conflict or external pressure, but due to the bondage of the unregenerated will. We really and truly don't want to come to terms with God. We want to run from God like Adam and Eve and sew fig leaves into a shame concealing garment. There is no one righteous, no, not even one. There is no one who understands, no one who seeks God. There is no one who does good, not even one. Romans 3:10 through 12. We depend entirely on God's mercy if we are going to live again and respond to Him. The man without the Spirit does not accept the things that the Spirit from the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, and he cannot understand them because they are spiritually discerned. 1 Corinthians 2:14. What can we do? Nothing. That's the point. Salvation comes from the Lord. Jonah 2:9. It does not therefore depend on man's desire or effort, but on God's mercy. Romans 9:16. After all, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. John 6:44. Here we come back to the lemonade story with which began this chapter. We want to get to work and become creative in devising a solution, but we cannot help ourselves out of this one. The saying, God helps those who help themselves, is thought by many Christians to be a biblical reference, but it comes from Benjamin Franklin's Almanac. It is not a biblical quotation, nor is it biblical at all in its content. God does not help those who help themselves. In fact, it is people like that against whom God swore in his wrath, they shall never enter my rest. Hebrews 4:3. Why? For anyone who enters God's rest must also rest from his own work, just as God did from his. Hebrews 4:10. Those whom God accepts are those whom he makes acceptable to God, to Christ. When we try to add our own concoctions to God's already perfect remedy, we spoil the whole thing and incur his wrath. We all know something is wrong, though. We know that something needs to be resolved. I was deeply impressed with the popular 1990 film Flatliners mentioned earlier, in which some medical students discover means of inducing death for a brief period in order to probe the afterlife. When resuscitating the body, they relived their sins individually, and they encountered threatening apparitions of offended parties. The students realized that one's sins do have consequences, that guilt is real. This is this is more than our society and sometimes even our churches typically grants. Carl Menninger, the famous secular psychologist, wrote an important book titled Whatever Became of Sin. In it, Menninger points out the dangerous psychological implications of denying the reality of sin and guilt. We know they are there and we can't get rid of them ourselves. Yet, the more we admit needs to be done by God because of our own helplessness, the more we feel indebted to God, and nobody likes to be in debt. None of us likes to see ourselves as he or she is truly. Consequently, we will pay pop psychologists, TV preachers, and entertainers to tell us we are, after all, good people. But if I'm okay and you're okay, why do we both feel so guilty? One thing that the Bible makes absolutely clear is that we depend entirely on God, not only for food, air, and shelter, but also for salvation. Remember the confusion that resulted when people began building the Tower of Babel, hoping to reach God. He has never been fond of towers. God is out of our reach, but we are never out of His. God doesn't grade on a curve. We can merit the favor of other people. For instance, many non-Christians are benevolent. A millionaire can make a large donation to charity, and we are all pleased to see him do so. But as long as that person is dead in transgressions and sins, and is in Adam, a rebel by birth and without faith, God actually considers that donation a sinful act. How repugnant to the human mind. Nevertheless, the Bible clearly teaches that whatever does not proceed from faith in Jesus Christ is in fact sinful. Hebrews 11:6. We cannot merit God's favor, and He is not impressed with even our best attempts. It is like trying to climb out of a sand pit. The more we climb and struggle, the deeper we get. The whole point to this is that God must somehow bestow on us His own merit, His own righteousness, if we are to be viewed unfavorably by Him. At this point in our study, we don't know how He will do it. In fact, we don't know whether we will do it at all. Just think about it. God would be perfectly just at this point to pull a sheet over the lifeless corpse of humanity. We could have pronounced the judgment about which to clearly warn Adam and Eve without providing a means of redemption. Salvation was never a given, but must not be taken for granted by us as though something is in God, something in the universe required God to save us. Although God's love moved Him to reconcile us to justice, that His love would not been violated if He had condemned all of us to an eternity without that love. Conclusion. This doctrine has been immensely practical not only in the church history but in history generally. As one example, it is virtually undisputed that it was this strong biblical doctrine that figured so prominently in James Madison's mind as he drafted the United States Constitution. The establishment of checks and balances within the power structure of the judicial, legislative, and administrative branches was due to Madison's conviction gaining thorough years of instruction under the Presbyterian theologian John Witherspoon, that we are all by nature the children of wrath, Ephesians 2:3, bent in on ourselves, and that given half the chance, we will further our own interests at the expense of others. Some might call this a pessimistic view of humanity. However, Madison thought it was a rather realistic view of the human condition. Because he did, the United States is happy to have celebrated the Constitution's bicentennial. This conviction is necessary for churches too. We have been losing our grip on biblical realism to the point where even in our own churches, we often fail to hold leaders accountable as though somehow they are too good, too holy to be questioned. But the doctrine of sin reminds us that none of us is excluded from the fall and its effects, that we are all by nature objects of wrath. No one is exempt from checks and balances on power. The doctrine also teaches us that there are no good people from God's point of view. Romans 3:10 through 12. Good here is not what self-righteousness. When we think of when we think of sin primarily as an action or a behavior, it's easy to think that a sinner is the town drunk or the bachelor down the street who's living with so and so. But when we see sin as a condition, we begin to realize that we are all sinners, even though we may think our particular sinful actions are pretty tame. We will never be what Adam and Eve was before the fall unless we become perfect, and only Christ's righteousness suffices. But through his disobedient sacrificial death and triumphant resurrection, we could be clothed with the very early righteousness of God himself. This was foreshadowed when after finding Adam and Eve hiding in shame, God pointed to one who would crush Satan's head, Genesis 3:15, and then God himself changed the homespun fig leaves for the skin of a slaughtered animal, prefiguring Christ, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. John 1:29. This means that we have to stop concocting our own lemonade. We must surrender our fig leaves and come to terms with our shame and guilt instead of running around the one with whom we have business. It means that we must stop calling other people sinners and recognize that we ourselves are unacceptable to God apart from Christ alone. I have heard preachers appeal to the goodness of Americans and their calls for moral revival. Deep down, I remember hearing one say, Americans are good people and honest people, good hearted people. All they need is to be shown the way back. But the biblical doctrine of sin we have just studied, if you really believe it, takes the wind out of the sails of individuals and movements convinced that moral reform, changing actions, is able to bring about meaningful change in human character. Jesus chastised the Pharisees for focusing on sinful actions without recognizing that the real problem is affections, and that those affections are ruled by whatever one's master happens to be. The Pharisees reasoned if we could just get folks to stop doing this or that, we would have a moral society. And if Jesus had simply offered a new, improved method of moral betterment, the Pharisees would never have disturbed his ministry. But Jesus reminded them again and again that the problem is the heart, not the hands, and that men and women are not just morally handicapped, but spiritually dead. Finally, this doctrine magnifies that great God's grace. If we do not know the seriousness of the diagnosis, we can't appreciate the cure. To the degree that moderns feel stressed out instead of guilty, they will tailor the gospel that offers a way to relieve stress altogether than guilt. But once one faces the real problem, he or she is ready for the real solution. Not only with this horrible, unflattering backdrop, can we now move on to one of the most exciting acts in the entire play.